Thank you, and thank you to my esteemed panelists here for raising some very important questions, issues to do with social context and educational context in learning, and also the great importance of engendering positive motivations in learners. But I think I'll come back to those points in my talk. But when I was asked to address this, I was asked to address specifically the question, learning without teachers, it couldn't happen, could it? Which you see on the screen. And I agreed to do so if I was allowed to set out a particular stance on this, narrowing down the answer to a particular domain of learning and educational context. And this is what I will do, as I will explain in a minute. But two general points to start with, and it seems that we have something of a consensus. My initial reaction to the question was to say, well, of course it can. And it does happen all the time. Learning happens in the mind of an individual, with or without the assistance of another person. The question, therefore, needs to be rephrased, I think, to consider the appropriate role of teachers in learning and whether we're getting this right in light of technological and other societal developments. Secondly, and just to be clear, I would add that I am a great fan of technology as an aid to both learning and teaching, and not just a gadget person, as my colleagues think. And I would go as far as to argue that nowadays technology is a necessary but not sufficient component of any educational mix. So it's here to stay. We have to live with it. However, I also believe fervently in formal education that the teacher is another necessary component. And so the challenge is to deliver on the promise of technology by getting the best out of a combination of both. And I think that's, if you like, the take-home message. How do you get that right? But I'd like to narrow that down to my own area of expertise, focusing on a very particular case of learning. So the question of what you're learning becomes important. And in my case, the second language acquisition. And in particular, what I would argue is a unique example of teaching and learning, and that's English as a second or additional language. And as an aside, you might ask, what about learning other modern languages? But I think that's a topic for another day. And I'd particularly like to argue that English poses its own particular challenges. So for me, the question needs to be asked in the context of learning English in schooling around the world. That's the context, and how technology can support more effective learning, particularly in compulsory education, the so-called K-12 sector. This is where the major challenge lies for most educational policy makers in response to globalization and as English increasingly is needed as the world's lingua franca. So English has shifted from being just another foreign language, if you like, to a basic skill for life needed from primary onwards as an essential tool. So you have here issues to do with the nature of the beast and the motivations for learning it. But the size of the challenge is now enormous. The number of learners and the number of language classes in schools around the world, English language classes, is expanding year on year, and thus the number of teachers is being currently employed to teach children is expanding accordingly. And at this point, I normally make the point, point in the talk, that these days there are more people learning English in China than there are native speakers of English in all the other countries in the world. And in that case, the numbers are very impressive. 1.4 million people, nearly 400,000 schools in delivering compulsory education, and many millions of students, of course, most of them learning English as well as Mandarin Chinese. So here's a particular context you might like to reflect on. And it's also a good idea at this point to take a reality check on that and what it means. And 2 points I'd make here. I think we can conclude when we look around the place at the moment that for the time being at least, that teachers are a given. And they need to be factored into educational policies, at least over the next 20 plus years. they have jobs, salaries, pensions, etc. to be taken into account for a start. And moreover, I think most societies currently understand schooling in particular ways, which include the conventional roles of teachers. And if this is to change, and it will take several decades to do so, we have to also have acceptable ways of seeing the teaching roles develop to bring the additional benefits we're looking for. Another reality check, I think, is that we bring us back to relevant theories of teaching and learning, and why we believe that teachers can and do make a positive difference. Teachers, as more knowledgeable others, are usually needed by learners, as we've already heard, to improve not just where they end up, but also the route and the rate of learning, to speed things up, and to provide scaffolding and forms of feedback and sensitive guidance, like the grannies, which fits a particular pedagogical model, and of which machines are not yet capable, the human factor. So again, in my view, teachers remain, as humans, an essential element in organizing formal education more effectively. And so I would like to argue, and continue to argue, it's the virtuous combination of the human and the machine that will achieve better English learning outcomes. Achieving a complementary relationship needs to be our goal. However, as part of that, the solution will need teachers to change, to accommodate to new and different roles within a broader understanding of learning environments. That will include initial teacher training and in-service upskilling to encourage and support the change. And in keeping with what we've heard before, there will also be scope for expanding what we understand by teaching and new roles for other stakeholders in supporting the learning of English in society. New concepts of classrooms, the so-called flipped classroom or technology-mediated environments, extending the formal environment throughout the week, not just the 3 lessons in school. New and better opportunities for learning outside of school. Cloud grannies, 10-year-olds helping younger children, or peer teaching with teenagers engaged in problem-solving activities. This is all part of the mix, but don't throw the proverbial out with the bathwater, I would say. The professionals still have a role in that. And there are 1 or 2 well-known examples which illustrate that progress can be made in this respect. And in particular, and I pick up what Sugata said, the Plan Ceibal in Uruguay comes to my mind as a particularly useful example of joined-up thinking and action. Uruguay, as you know, is a small country, very much at the other extreme from China. We're just over 3 million inhabitants. But I was very impressed by the progress being made there, as we've already heard. And when I visited last year and spoke to a man called Miguel Brechner, the inspiration behind the Plan Ceibal project. The Plan Ceibal is a Uruguayan initiative to introduce ICT into public education, beginning with the primary cycle and then expanding into secondary. And it's based on the well-known 1 laptop per child concept, deploying the basic EXO laptops. Ceibal, by the way, is C-E-I-B-A-L. It's an acronym in Spanish, but it's also symbolically the name of a local tree, the cockspur, to do with the metaphor of growth, I believe, and development. In the first 4 years of the project, the plan delivered 450,000 basic laptops to every student and teacher in primary education system, as well as no-cost internet with access throughout the country, including the remoter rural parts, so dealing with remoteness as one of the issues. It's believed and it's agreed generally that the plan has been a great success. And that's not only due to the technological innovations, but also to the related achievements, such as the creation of a training plan for teachers in primary, active inclusion of society, including teachers, in the project, and successful design and implementation of a monitoring and evaluation model to measure the impact nationally as a guide for the future action. So collecting feedback and feeding it in cyclically. This concept of joined up thinking. Positive impact is being researched and recorded, including, coming back to points we've heard before, increased self-esteem in students, improved motivation of both the students as learners and also their teachers, and active participation by parents. 95% approval rating according to a national survey for the project. And coming back to my own domain, a recent expansion of the project is Ceibal en Inglés, or for English, an extension of the program to provide English language teaching, and which was in part conceived to solve the problem of a lack of specialized language teachers or English language teachers in primary in the Uruguayan public school system. And this is a problem faced by just about every country in the world at the moment. So it's providing access in ways which wouldn't exist before. It allows primary school children in grades 4 to 6 to have 3 full lessons per week in English, one taught by a remote teacher who is beamed in, if you like, on video conferencing, a trained English teacher, possibly coming in from Colombia or somewhere outside of the country, to provide the input and to provide the language model. And this is then supported by 2 45-minute slots with the classroom teacher, who helps the children to learn with their laptops, but who also is often keeping one step ahead of her pupils in the learning of English. So the teachers are learning alongside the children. So this is, I think, is a very good example of this kind of joined up thinking. But to conclude, I'd just like to return to my own context, Cambridge English, part of Cambridge Assessment, as you heard. Cambridge English now operates in about 157 countries with over 4 million people taking our exams for many different purposes. And increasingly we are working with governments on their educational reform programs of the kind we've just mentioned. We recurrently find positive contextual factors which could potentially impact on successful learning. These include positive motivations and attitudes toward learning, and strong goal orientation, very strong needs for English, which are felt not only by the children but by society as a whole. But this is very different from attitudes we might find to learning other languages in the UK. This does not mean the picture is entirely rosy, quite the opposite. Despite positive societal factors surrounding English, the traditional schooling model, the teacher and the class of 40, if you like, is not delivering to the needs of society. The route, the rate and final destination in terms of outcome proficiency levels are still disappointing despite heavy investment. So to conclude on that, traditional classrooms are not adequate. We've been working on a theory, a strategy for dealing with this challenge. This includes an explicit theory of learning and assessment. We call it learning-oriented assessment, and a comprehensive approach to English teacher training and development. And technology is also a necessary component. It provides the tools for helping us to individualize learning and stimulating the supportive, language-friendly environment needed to develop proficiency, which is a long-term endeavor to get to high levels of English. It needs consistency over time. And we're looking to provide the kind of positive impacts we observe in the Plan Ceibal. So just to conclude, in answering the question, we also need to consider what is being learned and why that's important for society and especially for learners. And I hope you will agree that a case can be made for why English language learning brings particular opportunities and challenges, which in turn require joined-up thinking on innovative uses of both technology and approaches to teaching. And by the way, we are already having young children take their English exams on tablet computers. And with that, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.